let's start the presentation here in Chapter 8 with kind of a real high-level video. What are triggers? What are the types of triggers? What are they used for? Just some basic stuff. I'm probably going to introduce more questions than I answer with this video, but just consider this like an introduction to the next, I don't know, like 10, 12 videos, whatever we end up having here in this chapter. It's a fairly short chapter. Triggers by themselves are fairly simple topics. It's all the other pieces that work together, all the things you can do that makes you need to bring a whole lot to the table. Having said that, you're going to have to kind of wait till I give you some bigger examples to maybe fully understand what I mean. So let's get into it. This is actually a bunch of text here. So a trigger is actually a database object. So you know how like a view is a database object, a function is a database object, a stored procedure is a database object. Same thing with a trigger. You're going to write a bunch of code. You're going to call it a trigger. You're going to apply some other things to it, like what it does, how it works, what it's attached to, etc. But the whole functionality of a trigger is that it performs additional processing on incoming changes. Now we can define what those changes are, so we can say, you know what, I only want this trigger to fire. That's what we say when a trigger kicks off. I only want this trigger to fire for insert statements on the member table. So we can get very granular. And we're going to talk about all the different trigger types and explain this, right? But this idea of doing additional processing, we can go above and beyond things like relational constraints. You know, foreign keys are fine for doing things like I want to make sure that this child has a parent. But can a foreign key say that a parent may not have more than 4 children? No, that's not what a foreign key is going to do, is it? That's not what a check constraint would do. That's not what a primary key. So you have to have ways to do additional business rule processing over and above a constraint. This is where your triggers come into play. Okay? We'll talk more about those later, and I'm going to go through lots of real-world examples in this chapter. We're going to see a lot of fun things about triggers here. So another way of thinking about it, it's a predefined response to an action that a user performed. Okay? So you could argue that a constraint is a predefined response to an action. If a user tries to insert a duplicate primary key, the predefined response is no, throw you an error, not allow you to do that. Right? Well, your trigger allows you to do things that constraints cannot do. Constraints cannot correct the change. Okay? For example, let's say, I'm just making something up off the top of my head, but let's just say here that you have an incoming change, and that change is for a child record that has no parent. If we were just dealing with foreign keys, that would get rejected by a normal foreign key. Right? It would say, nope, sorry, no children allowed. In a trigger, though, we could say, okay, if I have an incoming value that has a parent that's not found, instead of rejecting this row, I want to set this to -1 because there is a matching parent for -1 that means no parent. Okay, we'll see, but you're predefining what the response is to a user action. And here's a cool thing about the trigger. They can't be bypassed. Okay, the user can't like throw a switch that says don't fire my trigger. There's going to be one instance where that actually can happen. If you're doing batch processing, you're doing bulk loads, the default is that triggers do not fire because they would slow down the processing. The trigger is also transparent. The end user does not know when or if the trigger is working. Again, I'm going to go through all these, so I'm kind of staying high level. So I know that you're probably going, oh, that sounds cool. What do you mean then? We'll get there. All right, here's the 3 types of SQL Server triggers: DML, DDL, and logon. Now their names imply what they need. DML, anytime you can apply DML triggers for insert operations, updates, and deletes. That means that on a specific table, a DML trigger is tied to a specific table. You can specify what the response is when an insert happens, or when an insert and update happen, or when an insert or delete happens. Okay, you're predefining a response. Now, DDL triggers, these are your data definition language. This is when you want to do things like audit all of the table changes. So anytime somebody issues an alter table statement on the member table, you want to audit who did that and what the new changes are. Logon triggers we really don't cover on this course or in this course. That's more of a DBA side, but that would kind of give you the idea. The name implies what it does. We can do further processing when somebody tries to log in. We can audit things. We can check for the existence of values. We can enforce hours, things like that. I'll do this. We're going to cover DML triggers at a high level and DDL triggers at a high level for the rest of this video. Then we'll come back. We will spend a bunch of time showing and talking about DML triggers, designing real world solutions and templates. We'll then come back and do the DDL triggers. Okay. So DML triggers, these are very common. You're going to be using these, or probably going to be using these on double-digit percentages of tables. I don't use them on all of my tables. I probably use them on 15 to 25% of them, though. We kind of have to talk about what kinds of triggers there are first and why we would use them before I can kind of further qualify that. Now, when we talk about a DML trigger, we build the DML trigger and we attach it to a table. So a trigger is, you know how like a view or a function is just a database object. It's a standalone thing. We can go look at it over in the management studio all by itself. It's in the views folder or in the functions folder. Well, it's not the way the trigger is going to be. You're going to have to drill down underneath the table itself, and the trigger is underneath the table. So it belongs to a table. So when you build a DML trigger, you define the DML that it responds to for that specific table. Now you can have a DML trigger that does all three of these, insert, update, and delete. Or you can say, you know what, I only need a DML trigger for the insert statement. Again, syntax we'll look at in the next video here. Okay? So the idea of a trigger is it allows you to do more without the user knowing and without requiring any interaction from the user, right? So we're going to do things like audit trails, all kind of cool stuff. But these guys can do anything that a stored procedure can do. They can make changes to the database. They operate as part of the original transaction. That means that you can roll back the original transaction if something doesn't meet what your criteria or business rules are. Another way to say that, the transaction is not complete until the trigger is complete. Now there's three different types of DML triggers. We have an after trigger. This is going to be your most common trigger for, I would guess, almost everyone, if not everyone in SQL Server. An after trigger fires, wait for it, after the user has made the database change. We're going to talk timing here, a couple of videos here from now, a couple of slides from now here. But think of it this way. Let's say you have an update trigger on the member table. The user issues an update statement. The change is made in the database, and now your trigger fires. Before the transaction is complete, your trigger fires and does whatever processing you've coded into the trigger. Right? It's just SQL code, right? Right? Now, an instead of trigger, this is the tricky one. This is the one where I find people get kind of cross-eyed and go, what? I don't get it. All right. So an instead of trigger, the name is beautiful for this one. It is in no way a misnomer. It completely tells you what it does. Instead of whatever the user tried to do, your code runs instead. So the timing of this one's going to be the user runs it. Let's say you had an instead of trigger on member. Your user issues the update statement. But instead of the update statement actually running, your trigger code runs. End of story. All right. I know that one's tricky. You need some examples. We'll see that. Give me a few pages, a few videos, and we'll be very comfortable with it. I promise by the end of the chapter. Now, the before trigger, we don't actually have. Okay, this is actually not implemented in SQL Server. Instead, the fine folks at Microsoft decided to implement the instead of trigger. But a before trigger, the user would have, if we had a before trigger attached to update for the member table, user tries to update the member table, and before the change is made, before the constraints are checked, the before trigger would have run. It would have allowed the operation that the user passed in to continue. It just sort of would have injected that trigger code into the workflow. But again, SQL Server does not do these. Other systems do. SQL does not. We do the instead of trigger. So let's talk about the after and the instead of. Let's do the after trigger here. So an after trigger, whole purpose of it, it allows us to apply further processing, further logic after the table's data has changed. Okay? So again, the timing of this, user makes an update statement, table is changed, the after trigger fires, the transaction is then complete. Transaction stays open until the after trigger has finished, okay? So you don't want your trigger code to be overly adding a lot of overhead to your timing. Okay? Now, one of the big uses of an after trigger is for auditing. And I'm going to show you this. This is I don't know, it's probably half the after triggers I write end up being auditing triggers, I think. Okay? When you're inside the trigger code, so you as the programmer, when you're coding the trigger, you can query the before and after versions of the rows. All right, you remember when we were in chapter 6, and we were talking about the inserted and deleted tables? Remember the output clause of the insert, update, and delete? Right? Those were the virtual tables that showed the before and after images of the rows. Same thing here. We have inserted and deleted tables. We can see what the user changed. We can see what it was before they made the change. We can see what the incoming change is. We can overwrite their incoming change. We can audit it. Audit triggers are huge for your programming side of things. Auditing metadata, like we can actually add, I do this a lot with separate tables of things like login history, where I can intercept what their IP address was or their machine name, or I can't get the IP here in SQL Server if I pass that into from an application, but I can get their host name. I can get lots of information, all their user options stuff. So, rolling back transactions, I will I will probably say I don't do this part of it as often in an after trigger. I will probably do rolling back of transactions with an instead of trigger. So I'm not as, it's not as important to me to do business rules and constraints in after triggers as it is for me to do that in an instead of trigger. Okay? In other words, if I know that there's something that's going to prevent a transaction, a database change from occurring, I would rather prevent that change from occurring in the first place instead of trigger, rather than let the change get made and then look at the change to decide it should not have been made and rolling it back. So remember, after trigger timing, the change has already been made. If you roll back, that might be a large transaction, require a lot of work. So generally speaking, my rollbacks would be in an instead of trigger. I would have some logic at the beginning of it that looks up that business rule information and says, no, no, this would violate our business rule. I'm going to roll it back before you even make the change. I mean, the difference could be 20 minutes. I could instantly roll back an instead of because no change has been made. Or if I did the same in an after trigger, 20 minutes it takes to actually do the database change. And finally, my after trigger fires and then rolls everything back. Takes 20 minutes to roll it all back. So be aware of that. Okay? So your instead of triggers, as I mentioned, they fire instead of the operation. User tries to update, but we intercept it. Okay? So you have full access here to the before and after images as well. One of the cool things we'll find is this is actually kind of similar to a before trigger because the logic is done before those constraints are checked. Okay? This is where I'm going to be doing my business rules. Okay? Maybe even some correction. Lots of examples, trust me. Okay? Oh, in this one, your change, the user tried to make an update, that's not actually performed. Only the trigger code is what's performed. Now, a lot of times in the trigger code, you'll actually turn around and do what the user did. But just important to understand, it's in the name. It runs instead of the user's operation running. Now, the trigger timing, I'm just going to put this here. We will revisit this. Okay? So let's talk about after trigger timing. I'm going to switch over to blue. So after triggers. So the transaction starts. Okay. The user, what would we call that? Issues the DML. Okay. Or the DML. I'll do this. I'll say we'll use implicit transactions here. So user issues DML modification statement, insert, update, or delete. Okay. The change is made by SQL Server. And then the after trigger fires, which means it performs all of the operation in the code, at the end of which the transaction is then closed. So that's your timing of after triggers. Now, an instead of trigger, I'm going to switch to orange here. One, user issues DML modification. Two, the instead of trigger intercepts change and the trigger code is executed. And there is no step 3. That's it. That's what it means. It's no joke. It is an instead of trigger. It actually fires instead of what the user asked to do. Okay? So then I guess the step 3 would be the transaction would be closed. Okay? Now it does go very important here, or something very important is that in the instead of trigger, you can effectively redo the user's DML statement. You can, if they try to perform an update, you can perform the update inside the instead of trigger, and it will be written the exact same way. Okay? Now, you can have both triggers that work together. So you would have basically an after and an instead of. Okay? You could have the user issues DML. Okay? The instead of fires. And based on the code, performs, let's just call it an update. Okay? Now, the change is made. The update code, the trigger code of the instead of trigger performs an update. That change is made. Then the after trigger fires, and then the transaction is closed. Okay? This would actually be very common, so you can have both. Okay? The rule here, and we'll talk more about this, you can only have one instead of trigger per table per operation. Logically, that makes sense, right? Like I can, if I have an instead of trigger built on an update, I can't have two instead of triggers because only one thing can happen instead of the user making the change. After triggers, you're not really limited. You can have multiple after triggers on the same table for the same operation. Okay? You might have two update triggers. I've been in situations where that's very helpful, and you can control which one fires first. We'll talk about that. I think that's the last video in the chapter where we talk about multiple after triggers on a table and setting the order. All right. Now, DDL triggers. Let's do this one, and then we got to close out on this video here. The DML is for your insert, update, and delete. DDL, this is for your data definition language. You can have create, alter, and drop. Okay? And we can scope these for anytime this occurs within the database, anytime this occurs on this table, anytime this occurs on the entire server. But the idea, this is an after trigger. The user makes the change. They alter the table. They add a new column. After they have done that, but before the transaction is complete, your DDL trigger fired. And there's more that we can do. We'll see these here at the end. Oh, I thought that was the last page. This is actually it. DDL and DML are similar because they fire after the operation. Okay, so it's similar to an after DML trigger. And they operate as part of the original transaction. So the transaction is not complete until the trigger has completed, which of course means that in the trigger code, you can roll back the transaction. Okay, I know that's a lot. It's just like Blitzkrieg mind stuff there. Let's get into after triggers and talk about the syntax and how they work.